All right. What's going on, Yang Gang? It is us, McCoy, Melanated Council of Yang. We are here. We have somebody very special with us here today. My man Gray. Gray, tell the Yang Gang about a little bit about yourself.
Hey, what's up, Yang Gang? My name's Gray. I'm in Massachusetts. I'm part of the Massachusetts team. I've been on and off the Humanity First Movement Board, outreach volunteer leader for Humanity Forward, and just super excited about having a conversation today about gentrification and digging into it with some of the deep dives that I know MCOY is renowned for. So thanks for having me tonight.
Nice. Yes. So we are talking about gentrification. And if you guys haven't been aware, what we've been doing last week was took to Twitter and we asked everybody, like, hey, what are your thoughts on gentrification? Like, how has it impacted your community? And what are some things that you've seen good and bad? And we've got a lot of responses. A lot of people commented saying that they seen some good things happen with gentrification. They seen some bad things happen with gentrification. They seen businesses, being open because of they seen businesses being closed. We've seen a bunch of perspectives, and so what we're going to do is we're going to try to bring those perspectives to one place, have a virtual conversation with it, and like always, chat. You guys are always able to put in your thoughts because it affects everybody, whether you believe it or not. It doesn't just affect Black people. It doesn't just affect white people. It affects everybody because somewhere along the line, there was a business that's withstand the sands of time. But as time has moved on, those businesses got lost by the wayside. And so we're going to talk about that. And again, have that conversation and see what we can do to make it better. So without further ado, let's dive into it. Alrighty. So for people who don't know what gentrification is, would anybody, Gray or Toby, would you guys like kind of share your thoughts of what is gentrification and what does it mean to you, or how has it impacted you?
So the way I see gentrification is sort of, you have communities that are local you have people who are local to a community, maybe been there for decades, been there for generations. And oftentimes you have sort of an influx of new people, oftentimes higher income, maybe young professionals, or there's like outside contractors that do development. So building new, maybe nice apartments or building new luxury centers. And what happens is this often drives up the rent. And it's also sometimes displaces some of the local people and even local culture. Like if you had a mom and pop business or something that was well known in that area, sometimes they can't afford anymore to stay there because of sort of these outside pressures coming in. So gentrification often can be like this sort of, I don't want to just say it's whitewashing, but like sometimes you have a sort of like wiping out of some like local communities in history because there's like just more forces coming in. So I would say that's kind of a general way I see gentrification is just that sort of pushing out of people, whether it's intentional or not. That's often what will happen, is pushing out some of the local residents to make room for sort of new people coming in.
Yeah, I think Toby's pretty spot on there. I think the idea of gentrification is displacement, right? Like people live in a community, they live in a neighborhood, they've grown up there, their family's been there, but they've been renting the whole time. They didn't own anything in that area. And then as the ownership changes, they get priced out of that space. So I guess sometimes I confuse that or think about that the same way with suburban sprawl, right? Like how we spread out into places. Because I think in the Midwest, sometimes we like build out like long ways into different communities that were previously farmland. But that's different than kind of the gentrification of buying out buildings and then renovating them in a way where the community who lived there before can no longer afford to be in that space. And I know that, Toby's kind of in the Boston area, I'm kind of in the Boston area, and it's pretty ridiculous. If you look at some of the gentrification here, whether it's on the I'm missing the word here, the seacoast or in some of the South Boston areas. You know, a lot of the minority neighborhoods that have been in Boston have been, you know, further and further isolated from the city center, because, you know, due to healthcare or colleges or, you know, whatever businesses in the areas like expanded and priced them out. So.
Yep, agreed. I agree with you guys both. And there's some things that I've thought about as far as gentrification goes and kind of how it affected me is that I've seen communities that were once flourishing, that were once strong, that now they're kind of like going backwards, you know, and it hurt because I can see the potential that it has, but with that potential not fully being implemented, it sucks. Like for me, I'm from Grand Rapids. Like I wouldn't say I'm from Grand Rapids, but I was raised in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I've seen the little corner stores that are popping up from out of nowhere. I remember literally watching these apartment places being built up right behind my friend's backyard. It just literally happened overnight. And mind you, I live on the southeast side of Grand Rapids, so it's predominantly black. It's we have our sprinkle of white people there. We have our sprinkle of Hispanics there, but for the most part, it's predominantly black. And so I've seen businesses come and go. I've seen barbershops set up shop in the same one for like different seasons. They're here, then they're gone. Then somebody else comes in and does the same thing, and they're gone. You know, I've seen the downtown portion of Grand Rapids where it's like at one point in time they didn't have anything there. Now it's like a movie theater. They got a bunch of like shoe stores, clothing stores, and whatnot. Yeah, it's cool and everything else is great, but at the same time, you know, because there's a homeless shelter like smack dab in the middle of downtown Grand Rapids, a lot of the people that used to rely on that homeless shelter, now they're basically out. You know, they're outside. They can't come in, and they can't really do a whole lot of stuff that like they used to do. Like now they're not allowed to set up their tents in the places that they used to do it in. You know, now they're gone because it looks bad on the movie theater, or it looks bad on the bowling alley. It looks bad on this. It looks bad on that. It's like, well, how come you didn't guys put in the resources to build another homeless shelter, knowing that the current one is struggling, knowing that the current one is at capacity? You know, we have a homeless problem. Like, how come nobody's addressing that? And so on that aspect, I see both the good and I see the bad in it. So that's
and I think from that aspect, right? Like we don't want to say that, you know, adding things to a city, like I'm sure that people appreciate now that there's a movie theater in the city. They appreciate some of the things that are built into making the city better. But a lot of this I see as a failure of the urban planning, right? Where you're creating new products, new opportunities, new businesses in these areas, and we talk about, you know, kind of the downward spiral of capitalism, and you're not accounting for, or you're only accounting for the spaces that build you revenue, right? Just because the homeless shelter is not bringing in money doesn't mean it's not an important asset for the community of people who have been displaced or who are without housing at that opportunity, who still are a part of that city. Same with any of the other youth centers or any of the other public spaces that we've slowly started to push out of where and how we live because they're not currently bringing in revenue.
Right.
And to me, gentrification is more of a exacerbation of that problem, where you're only building things that are making money, and then people who don't have money, either they don't own the property that already exists, or they don't have money to keep the things that they've regularly been investing in, now have nothing. And that to me is a sad way to police and build policy in our cities for how we expand.
Agreed. Toby, you want to add?
Yeah, so that's a very, very good point, that you're building things that seem to have like this commercial value, right? So what happens when you have like what happens to community centers, or I mean, a big one that was talked about during the campaign, local journalism. There's like a lot of local sort of things that might not be the most profitable, but they really add a certain value to the community. But those things are not priced, they just can't compete with the market. And so what happens? Some store, something goes out of business, gets bought up maybe by a big corporate influence, or just whatever happens. And then now you have sort of these like pop-up shops. I mean, you kind of hear like the jokes or the stereotypes, like you now have like Sweet Greens on not every corner, but you have like a Sweet Greens in every city, or you have like these like smoothie shops or whatever. Like LA, I know it's huge there. Like there's a lot of these kind of yuppie sort of young professional type of like hipster type things, but like a lot of sort of what was there before is no longer sort of functional. And so it's unfortunate that you kind of have those forces at play, like things that really are important to these communities might not be able, like the homeless shelter. I mean, that's a good example I didn't even think of. I know in New York City, I remember hearing some borough, they were like adamantly against building a new homeless shelter, and maybe Queens or something. I saw this like a year ago maybe, and there was like a whole shouting match at a town hall. I don't remember how I even stumbled on the article, but stuff like that will happen where it's just like people are just so against things that maybe make it look worse, or my property value might go down. And there's of course, unfortunately, there's a whole racial component to that sometimes, where we've seen a lot of these neighborhoods when Black people would move in, property values would go down, or you would have, and this is a concept that I kind of linked as the reverse of gentrification, but white flight, which could honestly get its own segment. But essentially, you have maybe some Black people come in a community, and then a massive outflow of white people, because I guess those Black people were bringing down, this is like in the 60s, even before 1900 kind of phenomenon. So you would kind of have them bring down the property value. So then you have like a flood of white people, and even some upper class Black people also had the same kind of thing, where a lot of them left. And so then now you sort of are left with a lot of people maybe who are more lower class, and then they can't afford to upkeep some of the things in the community, which helps exacerbate that cycle of someone coming in, bulldozing over some like crumbling properties. And how did it get that way? Well, you had like a huge loss. And Ronald, I know this is like super close to you, because Detroit went from what, 1 point something million down to like 100,000 or whatever. You had so much of the population loss, and this is huge in the Midwest, like you said, Gray. It's like you have these sprawling areas, but then they're not even as populated as they used to be. And now they're sort of getting renovated. Some of it's gentrification, some of it hopefully is a bit more of a proper grounds up approach for rebuilding a community that doesn't force the people out. But that's just something that I thought of when I heard you say that about the homeless shelter, and how people aren't going to necessarily advocate for these things that might make their neighborhood look worse. And it's unfortunately a history of that kind of thing, where I mean, we've heard it with recently, like the low income housing being built in suburbs or around suburbs has been so vilified. And instead, you probably have some fancy swanky properties happening in low income areas. So it's like, what's really going on here? Right. It's like the reverse can happen, push out low income people, but we can't have low income housing in some of the nicer areas. But
what this makes me think
all
of
around can be kind of fortunate.
Yeah, what this makes me think of, both in the example of like the flight from the Midwest and focus on property value, right? Is Yang talked about during his campaign like globalization, right? And so anytime anyone with any smarts kind of was able to make it in any community, especially in the Midwest, they left, right? Because there just wasn't money there. And so in the same way that we're talking about gentrification and building up to me, it seems like a wealth accumulation problem, right? Because gentrification doesn't happen everywhere. It really happens in the big cities where business is at, right? So, it's happening in Detroit, but it's more concentratedly happening in cities like Boston, DC, San Fran, where Silicon Valley is, LA, right? Cities where they had a certain amount of culture, they had a certain amount of there was a collection of people in that area. And then as soon as they saw an accumulation of business, the people with money, with ownership, bought everything up and then improved it to a way where people who originally lived there were unable to afford it.
Oh yeah.
And I think it goes again into some of this fixation on property as a investment, right? Where because certain areas and certain cities have, you make a certain paycheck if you're in San Fran, if you're in LA, if you're in Boston, if you're in DC, if you're in New York, you make so much money in those areas, the property of that area is at a premium. And it's hard for you to make money to compete with them, and everything gets like that wealth, that business, that connection gets concentrated to those specific areas, right? And I think what we're talking about is a general unfairness to people who, no longer can afford to live in their neighborhood, right? Like that's really what gentrification is about to me. Is not. There are a lot of different issues that come with it, but essentially saying that for whatever reason, you're no longer allowed to live where you grew up because somebody else wants it more. And a lot of this goes into the history of many different minority groups, immigrants, descendants of slaves, not being allowed to own the property that they lived on because of redlining and things like that. So in the Midwest, it seems like less of an issue, right? Because in the Midwest, everybody was essentially, all Americans essentially were immigrants to the Midwest, and the property was cheaper, they could own it. So it happens less there. But on the coast, where we had a lot of shipment coming in, a lot of business, international business, that stuff was owned up from the 1600s.
Yeah, I believe it. I believe it. And it's funny you said that too, because I know with the Midwest portion of the United States, it's like, yeah, you wouldn't think about it, wouldn't hit hard, but like everybody's pointing out, like you think of Detroit and you think of how the automotive industry there impacted the people of Detroit, and how a lot of those once booming plants that did parts for Ford, for GM, for Chrysler, they are gone, and it almost makes it hard to kind of rebuild, and like I was telling Gray, before stream, so guess what?
Yeah.
And like I was saying, like I was talking about before, it was like there's been times where I remember going into Detroit, before the big crash happened, and it was still run down, whatnot. It still had its empty lots, but at the same time, you will look at okay, it's going to get better one day. It's going to get better one day. I moved to Colorado, came back to Michigan, and I looked at what's happening, and it's almost like a ghost town, really, in a sense. I mean, don't get me wrong. Detroit is still going to be Detroit. You still have Dearborn. You still have Inkster. You still have those suburbs of Detroit where, they're flourishing, but at the same time, the people that live in Detroit, it's almost like they have nothing, really. They're trying to get into whatever's left that's available. I just read an article that happened 5 years ago, where there's a white mayor that's been elected in Detroit in the past 40 years that's been around. And one part he's doing is pretty much cleaning up the crime, kind of like get everything squared away. But at the same time, it's like he ushered in, some new businesses that came in. He made it where, anybody that wanted to set up shop, they could do that. But the Black-owned businesses that have been there for years and years and years, they feel like as though they're getting pushed out. They're getting left out to the wayside. And so now it's like, now you got this struggle that's going on in an already, I wouldn't necessarily say broken city, but in a city where it was so viable and it was the place to go. Now you got it kind of like this. As of right now, what's happening in the city of Detroit, I really couldn't tell you, just due to the fact that hey, what's going on, boys? What's going on, homie?
Hey,
Mindful skeptics in the house, you know. And again, it's just one of those cities where it's like it hits hard. It hits hard. So, Yeshua,
What up?
go
What
ahead.
up? Huh?
It was say great. Was you going to say something?
Yeah. So what you made me think about just now about how, this mayor is focused on crime and, and businesses are struggling. To me, it makes me think that a lot of the gentrification issues we're talking about are fractals of the bigger income inequality issues, right?
Mhm.
That we're having. Because if we really invested, at the bottom with people, had like a UBI type system, then would maybe people would be pushed out of their neighborhoods or whatever, but they would have enough income to like invest in the next thing. Because even the businesses that exist in a town, right? Like if they're struggling, that's not so much a reflection on. It's kind of a reflection on their business, but it's also a reflection on how much money is in that area, right? Like with Boston, it's easy for Boston to gentrify because there's so much money here, right? Like just between all the schools and all the startups and the pharmaceutical industry being like heavily rooted here. But with Detroit, automotive got pushed out, and like, what's the replacement business for them? So any gentrification that happens, there's like a small concentration of like wealth from whoever is left over. And then anybody who was established there from the past, like who is their market? Who are they serving? And like, do those people even have the funds to keep those businesses rolling? Right. Which plays into exacerbating the gentrification that, we're talking about.
Right. Yeshua, I want you to chime in on this. I know you live in the DC area.
I live in DC.
Right.
DMV.
Hey, what
DMV.
part?
I'm in Southeast. The average income in DC is like 85,000. I live in one of the last hoods in DC. There's about 3 of them, 3 or 4. Also, I have an early personal story with gentrification. I'm from Baltimore originally, and projects that I was in, Murphy Homes projects, got torn down a few years before they moved everybody out on Section 8 programs. In the middle of Rockville, Montgomery County, Maryland, is pretty much just a sea of white, and then they had one neighborhood where they would center us in. So it was good and bad. A lot of people were displaced, but however, growing up, it did help diversify me a lot, to the point where I was able to constantly get jobs left and right because I was able to do a good switch up. So that it did kind of have a positive impact on me in a way, with all of the bad and that comes with it and the displacement. And so there's, I guess I can recognize that. I don't think I will be able to recognize that if I didn't go through it and be in that sea of white people in Montgomery County to even, to even adapt to being able to, I don't know, pronounce my words in a way that they like, or to speak proper white English. So that definitely helped a little bit. We ended up moving further down towards DC. Prince George's County, Maryland is pretty close. I live actually I'm in DC, but it's like the next couple blocks away is Maryland. So we ended up going down there because it was cheaper. Once my mom got kicked off of Section 8 for getting a job, we had to come down to Prince George's, which is not Baltimore projects, but it's still pretty hood. And now a lot of people from DC are being forced into moving back or to moving to Prince George's County because it's just a lot of neighborhoods are getting completely rebuilt. Actually, right where I live right now, right behind me, there's a whole new 6 townhouses that's been being built since I moved here in February. But yeah, I'm not sure where it's going. I don't want to speak, too much about Mayor Bowser, the mayor of DC, but a lot of people say that she's accelerated the gentrification. I guess with the developers or allowing the developers to develop at a higher rate. I know there's a I don't know the exact percentage, but these new buildings that are being built up, I think they're required to save a percentage of their units, a pretty small percentage. I'd say it's probably like 15% of their units for lower income residents. Now, that's great. Also, it doesn't, the applicants to these places still have to be subject to credit checks, which usually doesn't go hand in hand with low income. So it still doesn't do it. All like that stipulation just allows the developers to continue developing. And it's DC. People weren't supposed to live in DC to begin with. It was for the government from Maryland gave the land. But yeah, so people live here now, and it used to be called. It kind of still is called Chocolate City, but it used to be really called Chocolate City. And now, when these new census records come out, I'm pretty sure because DC, I guess at right now, I'm pretty sure. Maybe look it up, but the Black people have the majority as far as percentage per capita in DC. So it's been like that, I think, since the 60s. Black people were the majority race in DC, and I think it's still like that now if you were to search it. But the new census, for this year, there's no way that can remain. I'm pretty sure.
Right.
So, real change is not much space for us to go other than Maryland because DC's kind of small. So
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned the census too, which is really important, you guys. If you guys haven't done your census, if you haven't done it, we all suggest you go ahead and you do it. You get county, get represented, because that's money. And if you think about it, that's money getting pumped into your community, getting pumped into your schools, and getting pumped into the local businesses, which kind of brings up another part of this topic of gentrification, where, as I spoke about before, the city of Grand Rapids, we've seen a lot of things being built up, but at the same time, there's a lot of Black-owned businesses that are sprouting up in the city of Grand Rapids. There's a nightclub, an all-Black-owned nightclub that's there that was started by a couple of people that I probably went to high school with, and so a lot of people are coming there just to kind of pay homage and other stuff. I know there's a bunch of beauty stores that's been opened up since money's been funneling it into Grand Rapids. Like I said, I mentioned a movie theater. There's a bowling alley there, but there's also like a Black-owned clothing store that's down there as well. So there's a lot of good things that's happened in the inner city of Grand Rapids that, with gentrification, has been going on. We got a lot of good things, and so just want to kind of get your guys' thoughts on it. Like, how have a lot of things helped the Black community kind of get access to capital that you think is possible, or is it still an issue in your guys' areas? If you know,
I say in DC, since everybody's so close together. So whatever neighborhood you're in, you can go 2 blocks over, and it can be. So the hood right now, like just a couple blocks over, it's a pretty predominant neighborhood, or across the bridge is Southwest. So from block to block could look a lot differently, but there's not too many hoods left. So, but we're pretty close in. So there's we're able. It's a mix, which actually, so you can see white people kind of jogging through the hood every now and then. They might just not know where they are because they came from 2 blocks away. And as far as you say access to capital, though, well, there's been some Black-owned spots opening up, but not much for this year, of course. So it's been a lot of closing downs, actually, but not just Black businesses, just businesses in general have been closing down. And Black businesses usually are hit pretty hard because they have the least amount of resources usually. But I think they're doing pretty good. I got a couple vegan spots, Black-owned, that are still open, and I'm proud of them. There's a few in Baltimore and DC actually. So I'd say accessible as far as do not have to go too far, or can walk to it, or take a bus or train to wherever you want to do business, or even at, like we talked about a few weeks ago about access to healthy foods. So there's not much in the hood, but you can take a bus ride or I don't know, Uber Eats or something. I drive, but a lot of people make fun of me driving in DC because it's so small. Just want to let you all know you don't need a car in DC. But yeah, there's access to a lot of things as far as geographically. But a lot of things are definitely run by money that puts up fences and barriers for what we're trying to do. But there's a good collective of Black people. I would attribute that to Howard University, of course. So Black people come from all over the country, and Howard brings them in. So I think that's been keeping us pretty strong in DC for sure, because a lot of the original Washingtonians, the Black people that have been here, have either moved away or probably moved away to Maryland, or there's still a few here. But like when I was bartending, I would rarely see a DC ID. Most IDs were from other places. So.
Yeah. So the question you asked Ronald was originally about lack of. Can you just kind of say that again?
Okay, so I know that when we were talking about gentrification and whatnot, I know we kind of look at the negative aspect, but I want to kind of bring in the positive aspect. Like I said, in Grand Rapids, the downtown area particularly, there's been a lot of Black-owned businesses that sprouted up, and I just want to kind of get your ideas or your takes as far as, have you seen Black-owned businesses being sprout out because of what's going on? Have they been able to get access to capital because of what's going on, or is it still hard for them to get access to capital to even start up a business?
Oh, that's interesting. All of those things, I have something to say. So it's one thing that I've kind of noticed is a lot of like the Black-owned businesses I see, especially here in the Boston area, because I'm in this Boston Young Black Professionals group, maybe like 3,000 of us in a group me. It's kind of crazy, but yeah,
it's
great,
wild.
great.
It's wild. Like it's buzzing all day, every day.
Yeah, I can't pay attention to it like really ever. But when I go look in the chat, sometimes I see all these people promoting their own Black businesses. But a lot of it's like online, almost Etsy type stuff, or maybe they're like creating goods, like they're creating some kind of custom goods. I mean, it could be shirts. There are people who have services, right? There are like Black-owned. Oh man, like there's really anything that you can think of, and because Massachusetts is legal, marijuana is recreationally legal. There's even maybe like certain. I think there's just a Black-owned dispensary that got opened up in like Brockton, some place that's like a pretty heavily Black area. So you do have some opportunities to tap into some of these new industries, right? And that's good. So the fact that a lot of these things are online too, I guess, helps take away some of that, like, oh, you're getting priced out. So if you're trying to actually own a physical building, you're not actually, you don't have to deal with that sort of skyrocketing rent if you're able to kind of, do something a little bit different, or maybe sell things wholesale with warehouses, which will be a bit cheaper. So I feel like there's ways that Black-owned businesses have been thriving, but I don't know quite, like there are people who are local to communities, but it's interesting when I see like a lot of people supporting online business, because I'm like, where's that money going? Right, you're not necessarily supporting the brick and mortar store in downtown Boston. You're supporting Black people who are like Boston natives. So sometimes it's interesting in thinking about how that circulates more virtually versus like people who used to exchange goods in a store. So I would say that there are opportunities for like the Black community and Black businesses. It's just a bit different and more digital oftentimes. So that was one thought I had on that. It's interesting. When I was in upstate New York in grad school, Troy, New York, and that area has its Black communities, but most of the people there were at my university, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, or RPI. And, those people are mostly out of state, maybe they're from New York City. And RPI was actually interesting. And I saw something when the MCOY Twitter posted the question about gentrification. One person was saying how where they are, I think they were talking about UPenn, and how that area, which I guess is Philly, they actually, I guess, buy out certain areas in actual Philly, and that would kind of cause gentrification. It can give some opportunities, like if you're a college student or you're like a young professional working there, but if you're a local resident, it can have a negative effect. So Troy, New York, RPI, they would actually buy out like hotels and other properties because they don't really have room to actually build because of the structure of the city. So they'll like buy out properties and turn them into a dorm. And like, I know there are people who've done things like there was one Black-owned business in downtown Troy called Troy Kitchen, and it was like a young Black, like maybe early 30s, a guy who used to be an engineer apparently, and he decided to take advantage of some of these like properties. So he turned it into like a little food court, and he charges, the food court a certain space for a year or two, and then they usually move out to become their own business. So there is some like more kind of pop-up shop type stuff that I have seen Black people take advantage of. And there's like even an accelerator, like a kind of innovative accelerator. I don't know if that was exactly Black owned, but I know some Black people who would try to do creative works in there. So I do think I see people taking advantage of some of the more young professional, new innovative types of structures, and I would say that's smart to do that the best that you can. So it almost makes it like, wait a second, are we the gentrifiers as Black people sometimes? Like I've heard that, like, I know some Black people who live, in these kind of areas that are low key more gentrified, like maybe mostly Black, brown neighborhoods, but they'll live in a part where they see more white people. So it's like, wait a second, even some of the Black professionals will be in some of these areas where you would see more white people or like other like young professionals. So I guess it's just like, okay, might as well do it too, right? For better or for worse. So that's kind of like a few of the thoughts I had about that. It can be good. There's people taking advantage of it. It's just, you have to be on the right end of it. Like, Yeshua, you got lucky being where you were, you got on the right end of it. So I feel like our generation, young people, we have a good opportunity to, but the question is, will everyone else, like the local residents, be able to sort of adapt and sort of become like, eat or get eaten type of situation? Will they be on the other end?
I hear you, Toby. Greg, how about you?
So I was going to say that when it comes to Black businesses and how they're faring and everything that's going on, I mean, I think all small businesses are getting, if you're not a big corporation, it's pretty hard to like cut through right now. One of the things I saw in different parts of Boston was that, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement and recognizing some of the racial inequalities on how businesses thrive, there was like a concerted effort to say, hey, let's go support Black business. Let's not just, rally for people in the streets, but let's put our money in their pockets and support them in that way. I don't know how much of that is still going on, but it was like a big push, especially earlier in the summer, about that I saw a lot of like resources and online ads and efforts about like, hey, go support these Black businesses as we're talking and having this discussion. To Toby's comment on, figuring out whether we're gentrifying or how we're sharing this space, to me, some of that and like how, and back to your question of how we gain capital, is really about like being involved in some of the local government on how we're allocating space, right? So one of the things that I started doing at the beginning of this year is that their neighborhood improvement programs, their neighborhood like developing centers that interact with your local government and vie for what you're allowed to do or what you're not allowed to do, how you interact with your local government and determine your zoning laws and who can build and how high you can build and that sort of stuff, right? And so sometimes the gentrification and the displacing of things is really, a developer or a landlord or whoever comes in saying, we're taking this space and we're setting the zoning rules so that you can only build this much housing. And now there's a limited amount of housing, it prices out, a certain group of people. Whereas, if more of us, if more Black people, if more renters, if more young people jump into some of these smaller local government institutions and say, hey, we want bigger buildings, we want cheaper, buildings. We don't need, especially in a place like Boston, we don't need as much space for parking. We don't need as much space for, some of these other considerations. Then we can set some of the rules on how we exist in these spaces. I think a lot of times, me especially as like a renter and a young person, like I'm not involved in these things because it's like, how long am I going to be in this city? But I also recognize that at some level, if I'm not stepping up and advocating for other young people, other Black people, other renters, then no one is going to do that, because the only people who show up are like old white people who own property, for lack of a better group. Oh, someone's talking about certified business enterprise. Yeah, and everyone has like different groups that set the housing standard and the zoning standards. And that to me really is how you bring back some of that capital, is that you argue in those rooms, with your local officials to say, we need space for businesses, we need space for, Black businesses especially, and so that you have your spot.
Man, great. I'm glad you brought that up, because funny enough, we've had like a little small conversation of having more Black people getting involved in their local politics, because it is so key and it's so crucial. I mean, Toby, you can vouch for it. Yes, but you can vouch for it. That's pretty much what we talk about. Like, get active, like in your local politics, because whether most people believe it or not, that's where a lot of those zoning laws, they take place on a local level.
Yeah.
Where a lot of those redlining stuff happens is more so on the local level. And so the more you get involved in the local politics, the more you get involved in the local shouting match, like, hey, I don't want you doing that because that's going to affect my community, which is going to help, which may actually hinder the local economy that's going on, because these businesses, they've been here probably longer than you've been in your seat. So no, we don't want that to happen. No, we don't want you to do this, because that will hurt me as well. So I'm glad you brought that up, which goes into another I would say another discussion topic, because again, we know that election season is coming up. We know it's already upon us. And so with the things that are happening now in our local community, especially when it comes to gentrification, how do you guys think that it will affect the election, whether it's local, whether it's state, as far as your guys' opinions? How do you think it will affect the election?
I'd say in the primary, I want to remember, but there weren't too many places for. I think there was only a small percentage of polling locations open, and they were not in the hood. So even though it's pretty small, people did need to travel to go vote. There were like 2 locations in Southeast, but versus the normal like 20 something. It did cut that a lot. Not sure much else other than that. When it comes to, you're talking about the election, as far as going forward, I mean, I don't know. I think people are pretty serious about voting this year. Virginia early voting in Virginia just kicked off last Friday, and the lines were way longer than usual. So I think that was a good sign. I think people are, and then it's even more young people than 2016, even more young people than 2012. So Obama started that young wave, or in a way. So young people are getting more and more into politics for sure, and it's not slowing down or stopping. So I'm hoping that. Yeah, I think a lot of people are going to come out to vote one way or the other.
Oh yeah.
DC, however, though, like a lot of us in DC aren't big on voting really, because it's not even a state. You don't really feel like it matters.
Yeah.
A lot of times we just kind of do it for the formality, but also for the local elections.
Yeah. To me, I think a lot of where the impact is going to be made is, when people show up to vote, are they paying attention? Are they checking ballot PD? Are they looking at who they're their local officials are, right? Like at the end of the day, like there's so many people, there's so many things that play into the presidential, that's going to be what it's going to be. But when it comes to how your neighborhood exists, who exists in your neighborhood, who has capital in your neighborhood, who can afford to be in your neighborhood, that really depends on like whether organizers are doing a good job and whether people are paying attention to who that local person is and holding them accountable or not.
Yeah, I remember when I went to go vote against Trump in 2016. When I went to go vote, I didn't know anybody else on the ballot. So, and that was, that was kind of before I started getting into politics. I just kind of got my arm twisted to go vote by my girlfriend. So,
yeah.
But I noticed I didn't recognize any other names. So I was like, wow. And these were the local people that I probably, should have known. So,
yeah,
I pretty much made guesses, and then like they had representatives out front of the voting place. So it was like a real quick, who are they? What are they talking about? And just kind of made a quick decision just to fill in the blanks. So,
yeah.
I've been doing more research this time around for sure.
There you go.
That's what it's all about. So in general, you're kind of asking about how this housing and gentrification and all this will affect the election or affect voting. So I guess as an issue, I mean, I know, so part of the reason I even suggested that this topic could be covered is because I remember when all the protests were happening in May, June, I would see that like fire, gentrify chant where people were, I guess, really upset about like, hey, look at all these areas that used to be more popular with Black people. Now those people have been sort of pushed out. And, I don't hear about it as much of a topic as some other things nationally, but yeah, I have seen people marching. I have seen people, tied into other things. Like when in Louisville, Kentucky, the mayor, someone was giving like some press conference, I guess, regarding Breonna Taylor's death. Very well organized people in like all Black, like Black Lives Matter protesters came in behind and started yelling that fire, gentrifier chant. And it was actually kind of hardcore. So I feel like that concept of gentrification and like, that's actually part of what happened in that case. I remember they were talking about how with that community that Breonna Taylor lived in, there was, I guess, like a lot of like suspected drug users or dealers. And there were a lot of people, especially white people, who wanted this. I mean, a lot of people want these type of areas cleaned up, but it kind of got to the point where I guess there was more pressure to do these type of operations, like the no-knock warrant that happened. So that was almost like a gentrification kind of led to some really extreme practices like that happening. And so it ends up being the case that maybe it will be a driving force where people are going to want to like address all racial injustice and different things that intertwine, even though Biden is not necessarily the representative of this movement by far, but people feel like they have the best chance maybe to organize against. Like I think Angela Davis said, vote for whoever is easiest to organize against. So if these people who really feel gentrification is a big issue and that it affects other things and safety and economic security, then people might be motivated to address it. And by going on the ballot and voting. So.
Okay. Well, we got Gordon Wolfo.
Yes.
As representative is Eleanor Holmes Norton. They have full voting privileges on the House floor. That's crazy. That's crazy.
Yeah, I've heard.
And out of state, man. That's another reason why they won't allow that to happen. That's 2 extra seats in the Senate. For Democrats. They're not letting that happen.
Yeah, there was an article about it was either Ted Cruz or Mitch McConnell talking about how that was unacceptable for them as a Republican, right? Like DC getting seats, Puerto Rico getting seats, even though those are our citizens and our people, it absolutely makes sure that they can't have a majority and throws them out of the contention when it comes to how they're represented. And they know that, like they're very clearly aware of that. So it's a shame because it does. It means that, the people of DC, the people of Puerto Rico get less than, less representation than the rest of us. And that's not really cool.
Right.
We have council members and we have ward members. There's different like wards.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Definitely a senator, and Eleanor Holmes Norton. She's a representative.
Yeah, and I'm listening to you guys' stories because, I mean, of course, you guys are pretty much more so on the West Coast. I'm not West Coast, but on the East Coast side of the United States. But yet at the same time, you guys bringing in a different perspective based upon where you live, and I think that's key, and I think that's crucial for everybody to know, especially those that are in the chat, to kind of understand that it doesn't always have to happen, one way. That there's so much more that goes on in each other's lives, in each other's neighborhoods, that is worth highlighting. It is worth talking about. It's worth putting that information out there, because if we don't, and if we continue to ignore the bigger issue at hand, there's probably not going to be anybody else that's going to talk about it. And especially in this kind of light where it needs to be talked about, where it needs to get put out on Front Street. It needs to, be advocated for and let know, like, hey, this is what's going on in your neck of the woods. This is what's going on in our neck of the woods. And if we could find some kind of common ground to reach for and fight for, let's do it. It may look different on your end, it may look different on my end, but at the end of the day, as long as we set some kind of platform, as long as we set kind of floor, or even have a plan set into place, let's do it. Why not? Why? Let's give it a try. Let's see what happens. I was talking to somebody, Roberto, and the one thing that me and him kind of agreed on was let's try and get a plan together as far as what we can do to get more Black folks involved in their local politics, in their state politics, in their federal politics. What can we do to give Black candidates that are running some kind of platform to stand on, but not necessarily for the vote, but to talk about what are you trying to do. I don't know who said it, but somebody mentioned that we have these representatives that are running in our districts, that's running for our areas, that we have to hold them accountable. And then I feel that, yes, that is absolutely true. Like, if you're going to run for my district, if you're going to run for my area, I need to know at the end of the day, can I hold you accountable for what you said that you were going to do? And if you're not going to do what you said that you were going to do I have that same right to say, I'm not going to vote for you, I'm not going to waste my time for you because you wasted my time already? Is that possible? Just throw some stuff out there. And Gordo, he's been on it right now. I think DC has a bigger population than Montana. Joshua, do you agree with that one?
I don't think so. I didn't look it up, but I think DC only has like 700,000 or something like that. I don't know much about Montana. But yeah, I guess somebody can search it out real quick. But I know we are packed in pretty tight, and now they're just building it up. So.
So Rhode Island does have a bigger population, Montana does have a bigger population than DC. They're a little over 1 million. Yeshua was right with DC having 700,000. I'm looking up some of the smaller states.
Mm-hmm. I think Wyoming, I could maybe see why, because Wyoming has freaking more elk than people. So that state maybe is outnumbered.
Good call. Wyoming is less than 600,000, so they are smaller than DC.
There it is. But again, it's just that experience, because when we think about what's going on now, like Yeshua was saying, it's like it's not building out, it's building up. We can see, and we already have seen what happened when when cities, instead of building out, they tend to build up, how they try to push more people in, push more people in, push more people in. And then they're like, oh, but the crime rate we see is going up. It's like, well, you push people into a corner and you don't give them the resources that they need to survive. You literally take away the one thing that could possibly save them. You took that away. And so now it's like they have no space. They're running on a limited amount of resources. They really don't have an infrastructure to run on because everything is all run down. And you expect them to be okay. No, that's not the case, you know. And I think with gentrification, with this topic, it highlights some of the things that could be improved. And I think, Gray, I know you mentioned that you wanted to kind of like, you know, talk about some solutions. And so I want to kind of give you that floor because I think from your perspective and anybody else that has a perspective of a solution, we should be able to talk about it. And again, you know, just do it like a little round table, round fire, popcorn, however you want to do it. But let's think of some ways when we could solve gentrification and how we can actually make gentrification work for us.
Yes.
So me and Toby talked about this a little bit pre-stream about the idea of buying back the block, right? Like gentrification happens because people don't own their property. When I lived in Oklahoma, I was blown away because there was this small business called Family Video. And I moved there in 2017, I think. And I was like, how is this video rental store still around? But the reason they exist and Blockbuster does not is because Family Video owned the property that they were selling on and Blockbuster was renting, right? And in the same way, you know, we as Black people, if we own the property that we're sitting on as opposed to renting it, then there's no pushing you off something that you have ownership over. Unfortunately, that's the way things work in this country.
I say comparing DC to some of these places like Oklahoma and Wyoming, there's no space here, you know. So it's like there's no.
Yeah. And buying property in DC is at a completely different level than buying it in Oklahoma or Wyoming, right? So that is some of the solution, right? If you have the capital, like making sure that you own the space that you're in. Yeah. The other one I think is being heavily involved in local government and how zoning and how urban planning exists, right? Because
hold up.
At the end of the day,
we got
people are making decisions on how much development is happening, right? And a lot of times they are, especially in places like DC and Boston and like in the cities that are more desirable, they are intentionally limiting the amount of housing that is available so they can jack up the price and put it at a premium, right? There's no reason that a city like Boston should have a housing shortage, right? A lot of people want to live here. There should not be a housing shortage, but we're not taxing.
Boston is pretty dense, isn't it?
It is pretty dense, but it's also only like 3 stories high at most places, right?
Okay.
And we easily could build a lot bigger to have more people in. If you look at other cities like across Asia, like Shanghai, Taiwan, Singapore, Tokyo, you know, Seoul, they have skyscrapers. They build really high up because they have a small piece of land that everybody wants to be in, and they build the housing to make that accessible. There's no reason that in the US with as much money as we have, we cannot do the same thing, but we've chosen not to, right? We've chosen not to create the housing to meet the demand for all the people who are here.
Come on.
So we have to decide that, get involved with the people making decisions and say, hey, more people need to live here. The cost of housing is high. You need to build more property until there is enough, until there's even a surplus of housing, so that people who want to be in the city can be in the city without being displaced.
Yeah, that'll probably be easier in Boston. I don't know. DC's like, I mean, they're building the building. So I think think originally, right when they got the square from Maryland, I think it was like 10 miles. 10 was it 100 square miles? I think now it's 60, 70 square miles. Like,
yeah, they sold the Virginia half. So Maryland and Virginia sold land to make DC, and then they ended up not using the Virginia half and selling it back to VA.
Yeah, so it's about 70 square miles. I mean,
yeah,
there's a fight. There's a fight for the property, and
yeah.
who's losing.
And Mark's comment is completely on point, right? The reason this is not happening is because we're viewing property as a vehicle for investment, right? Like to say, oh, I own this property and I'm expecting to make money over it over the course of my lifetime. And then people don't want to lose value on this housing, even though it should not be something that we're accumulating for cash. It's something we should be making for people to live in, right? Like that's the purpose of housing. It's not for money, it's for people to have shelter. And when we start treating it as a place for shelter as opposed to a vehicle investment or an investment for accumulation of wealth, then we would have it in a way where people are not displaced from the neighborhoods they grow up in. Right? But we're looking at it with the ends being capital as opposed to the ends being shelter. And we need to reframe some of that in how we're looking at housing. And not we, but like our leaders.
Oh, this is getting good.
Yeah, this is getting good. Like I feel like
a
housing.
lot of Airbnbs out here. So
yeah. And that's part of it too.
Man.
I just heard about someone. I forgot who I was hearing from, but Boston recently. Oh, I remember. Yeah, because Boston recently, I guess, had a law that you can't use Airbnb unless it's a place that you actually own, and also like I think even when it comes to owning houses, maybe the whole of Massachusetts, when you own a house, you can't rent it out unless you also live there. So I think people are catching on to these gamifications where you accumulate.
New York has some restrictions too. I can't remember which ones they were.
You said which one, or what was that?
New York. I know New York.
Yeah. New York has strict laws for Airbnb, and it could have been similar where it's like you can't rent, so you can't like just rent a place and then flip it for either use it for Airbnb. Where people were making a lot of money doing that in like Seaport area and other places, they would just rent the apartment, maybe not even live there for.
Where like
it's just crazy.
They were treating them like unregulated hotels. Is really what was happening.
Mm. Yep. So I guess that's like a micro version of it because that's not like a big developer coming in and kicking people out, but they're buying up housing that people need to be that people need to live in. And this is a good comment too. I remember hearing this. I mean, that's a big thing. Like culturally, I saw a video that talked about how coronavirus spread often in some of these communities because you had a lot of people living together and it's more crowded. And that can go into culture. There's different, a lot of immigrant populations, some Black populations, just different people where it's very common to have the elders and other groups. So that can make it make people more susceptible. Mm-hmm. That's like an interesting side note too. And there's so much that goes on with like this topic. And like, I know it is past 10, but like the last thing I was thinking of with the buying back the block, like you were saying, Gray. So you have famous people like I want to say T.I., Killer Mike in Atlanta who do a lot of outreach. I'm sure they would talk about like ownership and creating community centers. That's another thing is being able to turn these areas instead of expensive properties, make it a community center or something that is useful for the population. Nipsey Hussle, of course, he was a legend in LA. He had his marathon store and everything was very local. And that's the big kind of thing that would help where if people are rich people, powerful, like people who made it out the hood or just whatever, people who are successful and they want to invest back, buy these areas and turn into something useful for the community that's not going to push people out. And that's sort of like the ground up, right? Trickle up, right? We all, for those who were Yang supporters, we all knew about the whole trickle up economy. I mean, that's a general term too, but like that is like a perfect example where the people can sort of decide, like, first of all, if a lot of people have the capital, boom, they can help decide what the fate of some of these areas will be, these properties. But then also if you have sort of benevolent investors, they also can come and like turn these areas, right? Because it's like, instead of outsiders developing it, why not buy it yourself and choose what's going to happen? I think something in Georgia just got made where there's going to be like a Black-owned commune in some like rural area, and I forgot like exactly how much land it was and how much it was bought for, but I remember seeing an article some weeks ago, and that's like, all right, we're basically going to just like live, not off the grid, but they're going to live in like their own little community and like make a new, I guess, Black Wall Street in some part of Georgia. And that's an article, if I can find it, I'll post on Twitter. But
I think no, I lost my train of thought. But that is good stuff. Like, that's what I was thinking about, right? So a lot of people, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement, we're talking about defunding the police, which, is its own conversation. But outside of that, investing in the communities, right, to make sure that some of these public resources are available is part of, counteracting this gentrification. If you're looking for solutions, it's also making sure that your leaders know to invest in the things that make it easier for people to survive in these neighborhoods, right? Like, that people have access to all the resources they need, because cost of living is a big reason that people get gentrified out. It's not just the housing, although housing is a huge aspect of it, but it's also how much food costs in the area, how much it costs to get around in the area, how much, clothing and transportation and everything else goes on there. Those play a big part into whether this neighborhood is sustainable, whether people can stick in it after they've grown up in it. And like you're saying, Toby, with these community centers, like building things, and this is back to, I think, kind of the point that I was trying to make earlier, building these things, with the end state being a sustainable and survivable neighborhood, as opposed to one, where the end state is capital, is really the reframing we need to counteract some of this gentrification.
Yes. And for those that are tuning in, yes, we're talking about gentrification. We're talking about gentrification and how it relates to the Black community, but also at the same time, just your local community. Like, how has gentrification, played a part? Even if you don't have a large Black community in your city or in your area, just think about your local economy and how, like, some of these bigger businesses are setting up shop where your mom and pop shops used to be at, for years, and now those mom and pop shops are gone, and in replace with that, you got, just gonna throw it out there, a Starbucks there, or you got a McDonald's there, or you got a Wendy's there, or you got a local food chain there. Those ideas, those thoughts, and so we're just having a conversation about it. We've been talking about it for about a good hour, and it's been getting good, y'all. It's been getting good if you guys are tuning in. And I like the way how you guys have these solutions about buying back the block. And I think that is real key. And I think it's real critical, especially now, because of the fact that we see this big wave that's coming. We see it happening. And like somebody mentioned before, the coronavirus, what it did was it exposed those weak parts in our communities, in our cities, in our states. And so now we're looking at different ways of how to offset that impact. Of course, we've had our small businesses, they've been affected. We've had large corporations, they've been affected. And so now it's like, okay, we see this happening. We see everything going on. What can we do now to counteract those effects? But at the same time, what can we do to kind of like create this wealth, this capital that's literally right there? What can we do to tap into it? And again, I've seen it on Twitter, buying back the block. I've seen it multiple times, and it's like that would be one thing, because now we got this wealth, we got the ownership of the land that our business sits on. We get passed that down from generation to generation, and because it's ours, it's in the family, you can't get rid of it. You know, the one thing that I mentioned, maybe not on here, but I was teaching a Bible study at my church, and the one thing I mentioned was the one thing I want to do is I want to buy a piece of land. I want to own that piece of land. I want to build my house on that land. And when I die, I want to put in my will, no matter what happens, nobody in the family, they cannot sell it. They cannot sell it. However, if they want to add on to it, go for it. If they want to buy more, go for it. But at the end of the day, you cannot sell it. And so when I think about that, and when I think about how a lot of people tend to kind of invest in land and think in hopes that it'll turn around and sell itself. The one thing I learned in my accounting class is like land, it never depreciates in value, but you can always build the value up by doing a little certain stuff to the land. But if you just leave it at face value for what you bought it for and you turn around and sell it, you're just going to pretty much get the money you got back that you paid for. And so with these people doing Airbnbs and whatnot, and I see where you guys are coming from with these Airbnbs that are being set up. That's somebody's home that could have been there. That's somebody's piece of land that they could have owned. And rather than, you know, do the right thing and sell it off and use it for somebody else to own their own piece of pie to have this generational wealth, you're actually keeping that away from them, you know? And I like the idea of how that Black community out in rural Georgia, how they're thinking outside the box, like, you know, let's own this little piece of chunk and let's section it off little by little. And so at least that way we have our own. And if people want to come in, that's fine. If they want to add in, that's fine. I actually like that idea. And I think, Toby, that article that that you mentioned, I remember reading that. And I'm like, dude, that's dope. Like, why not? Why not find like some real rural secluded area that literally has nothing on there? Buy that, and then whoever wants, you know, little pieces of it, let's go ahead, let's break it off in equal parts. That's your property. This is my property. That's yours. That's yours. And if we decide to do another Black Wall Street, boom, we got our own local economy right here. So we don't have to worry about going outside. We can do it all inside and keep it all local and all centralized. That is a huge game changer. Huge game changer.
You're talking about what story did you bring up? You talking about Georgia where they bought 90 acres?
I think so.
It actually might have been in the MCOY chat where I saw it.
Yeah.
Yeah. A bunch of, I think it was a bunch of Black families. I can't remember exactly how many, but yeah, they all like 90 something acres. It's in Georgia.
Yeah.
I don't know where in Georgia, but you know.
Yeah, I mean, there's land out there. It's just that, again, with Black folks not having that accessibility to capital, it kind of puts a damper on it. But once we get people in office to be able to release those funds to those families that want it, you're going to see a huge shift. It may not happen in this generation. It may happen in the next 2-3 generations, but you're going to see that huge shift that's going to take place. And so for anybody that's watching, I encourage you, look at your city, your state, find whatever local land that's not being used. If you want it, get it. Some of these pieces of land, you can buy it with your tax money. And it could be like 2, 3, 4, 5 acres, and it goes for like $1,500. Go for it. You know, do what you can. Anybody else want to chime in?
I wouldn't mind that myself. I actually, when I was in Louisiana not too far back, maybe a week or two ago, my girl, her family lives right next to a piece of land that they had before, but they stopped paying on it. And nobody's touched it for years. And I was thinking about grabbing that.
See?
I'm not the biggest fan of Louisiana, honestly, but it was a peaceful vibe.
Mm.
Yeah, I have a friend who, when I was living out in Oklahoma, he bought some property in, I want to say it was Wyoming, just because like the land out there is mad cheap, and frankly, there's so much of it that like somebody owned, but if they haven't improved it or paid their taxes on it in like a certain period of time, I want to say it's 1 to 3 years. You can just stake it, claim it, and then like start to pay on it, and it becomes yours. And I mean, then you have to go and build the infrastructure out there, right? But some of the stuff is available, and I think that when we talk about, because it now seems like the conversation is shifting a little from gentrification to like the like black wealth, right? And a lot of the reason that median black net worth is so much lower than that of like our white counterparts is because we were systematically like excluded from like land ownership, right? So that really is how we catch up, at least in the current state, right? Is land ownership, improving it, and figuring out how to step up in that way. I don't know if it's the end all be all, but there are lots of opportunities for it if you're looking. I think that, earlier to what Yeshua was saying, land in DC and Boston and the cities that where we first came to and where we lived in, post emancipation is unreasonable, right? Like the cost of living in Boston is absurd, and if I were to try to buy something here, it would be even crazier. But there are places and facilities. Say again?
The average or median income in Boston?
No, I don't. Not off the top. But
Shelby, can't hear you.
Oh, thank you. Oops. I was just saying like oof because I remember $8. There was something I don't remember the median black wealth. I think in Boston was like $8 or $6 for 100-something thousand for white families in Boston. And for black wealth nationally, that's trending down. I wouldn't be surprised for Boston as well, trending down.
I think in Boston is worse.
Boston, not by race, just the total median household income is $71,800
in Boston. Okay, interesting. Wow. Okay, I'm actually a little. I wouldn't have known for like just the city of Boston. I would have actually expected it to be like very, very high, just to keep up with the cost of housing out there. So that's
there are a lot of like poor neighborhoods, like poor neighborhoods on like the outskirts of Boston, right? Like you talk about Roxbury, Dorchester, like up towards like East Boston and things like that. So that balance that out. I am certain that if you displace that by race, then it's a completely different level, right? Like you probably jump up 40K and then for everybody else drop it to like a much lower number. So yeah,
$8 is pretty low for a median black.
I think that's net worth though, not for income, right? Like,
yeah, that's net worth, and that will be a discussion about why that is. I think a lot of
because if you don't own your house, right? Like if you don't have the property, then that's where most people's net worth comes from. It's I own a car, I own a house, and I have a certain amount of stocks or like shares in a business.
Yeah. So that's a good one that we'll definitely touch on, and a lot of debt also. It's a lot of debt, just that a lot of a certain. So that debt, subtracted from the wealth that doesn't already exist is how your median is basically zero, which means if you remember statistics, that means like less than that median point, half of that is basically negative, and only over half of that median point is going to be, towards that tail end, and that's insanity. That like basically less than half of black people have negative net worth. That's basically what that means. But that's in the conversation for another day. Actually, I saw a comment that said Ben's Chili Bowl comes to mind. You may have put that up from Gordo Mofo. Which when I saw that, I was like, wait a second. Does that mean that they closed? Because I remember Ben's Chili Bowl. I've been there.
They're open.
Okay, good.
Unless they closed in the last week and I didn't know.
I was about to get freaked out. I was like, that can't happen. I've only been there 2 or 3 times, but I still.
Yeah. They have 2 locations.
I don't remember the one I've been to, but I think I've been to the same one twice or so.
You probably went to the one on U Street.
Probably.
The main one. There's a second location on H Street Northeast.
Okay.
But
wow.
I mean, either way, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I had one last thing that I thought of when it came to gentrification. I mean, I could touch on it maybe in another thing, because this was something I actually was really personally like, wait a second. I was kind of like, not triggered, but I was like, what kind of audacity is this when I read about this? But there was like this store, I think it's like a shop, a corner store in DC that plays go-go music. Yeshua, hopefully you know what I'm talking about. They've been playing this for years, 10s, 20s.
T-Mobile on Georgia Avenue.
Oh, is that it? And they would play like loudly on the corner.
There's a speaker outside for years. They've been playing go-go.
And it's just crazy because there was like some complaints they were getting from people who basically were gentrifiers, who or maybe colonizers is the word we're going to use here. But they basically came in, didn't like the fact that music was being played on the open, and now they're out here complaining. And I'm like, you can't come into the culture and be like, and that was like part of the social problem with gentrification.
Yeah, so it's the T-Mobile location. They've been playing music for like years and years and years, constantly. Like go-go music too, specifically go-go music on the big loudspeaker right outside the store. So like if you're anywhere near that intersection, I mean, you feel good. You feel that go-go. Yeah, white people did not like that. They made a big fuss about it. I don't know. They tried to hashtag don't mute DC. You can find out all about that.
I remember that.
We really didn't get into that part of the gentrification, the policing of, you move into a neighborhood and then you're policing it in a way where it's like, who are you?
Right. So the music's still playing. So.
Good. Because I basically made a whole post about it at the time. I was like, you don't go to Louisiana. I said New Orleans. A friend of mine corrected me and says the whole state. But I was like, you don't go to Louisiana and complain when they just randomly have parades for no reason and they're marching in the streets. You don't go to whatever. I can't remember what other example. I said you don't go to Florida and get surprised when people start eating people's faces off. I was a little bit I was a little bit wrong for that one. But basically you just gotta like adapt to whatever is there. And that's part of it with like being, I guess, socially responsible, is like that case wasn't economic, but they were trying to like socially have a whole uprising against the black people. I was like, what are you really like? What really are you doing right now? And I was like, that's like, yeah, no. but that was actually one of my big thoughts. But I kind of lost track of it with all the other conversations, which has been really good. The economic front and onions. But I was like, I had to address that. If you didn't know, gentrifiers be wildin'. This is why people mark fire. Yeah. But Gordon Mofo put their correction or their like clarification about Ben's Chili Bowl opening new locations. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. I didn't know that they were doing that. Or you mean? I didn't know they were opening new locations.
Yeah. Nat Stadium food court. I guess it's just like it's a way to take advantage. You can expand out, and it's like rather now you're like a locally owned place that is expanding out, and now you're like that young professional, but you're from the area, but you're taking advantage of the kind of expanding of the city, like the urban sprawl or suburban sprawl, like was said earlier. But that's about all I got.
Man. Greg, you made an interesting point. You said the policing and how that's being a part of gentrification. Explain that to me, just for like a brief second.
Yeah. So a couple years ago, me and the fam did a road trip up California, right? And we're on Venice Beach, talking to some Venice Beach bums, right? And they're upset because Snap Inc. set up a new location. And they're essentially like clearing, a lot of the people here, right? And so I think one of the big gentrification is not just the displacement of people who grew up in the area, but also like policing it and reframe, like you're capturing, reframing the culture in a way that helps you best capitalize on it. So people in sense were upset about the fact that the people who like to be out there, who like to be on the streets, skateboard, do whatever, essentially felt like they were being pushed off of where they wanted to hang out because they were trying to capture that space to take pictures of it and make money and reframe, their spot. And the same thing they're talking about in DC, where people are trying to mute DC. This is part of the culture of the city and how we live and how we want things to be. Somebody else comes in, they start buying different parts of the block and then policing the behavior of how everybody who has lived there have been, doing things, right? So you're not only coming in and making it unsustainable financially for people who exist there to be in that space, but then you're also, changing the behavior so that it suits you as the quote colonizer in that space, right? And to me, that's the difference between like gentrification and something like sprawl, right? Where I was talking about like in Oklahoma, in the Midwest, in different areas, they're going and improving different territory, but no one lived there before, so there's no like erasing culture that you don't like, right? Because there wasn't anything there. In the neighborhood I grew up in, like in Virginia, there was a big dichotomy racially, but the area that they improved on was all farmland. So no one was there before. There was nothing to really drastically change about it. They just built a bunch of stuff and made a bunch of money.
Okay.
But for places like DC, for places like Venice Beach, I'm sure this happened in areas of Boston with like either Irish immigrants or the Haitian immigrants who are there. They're not only pushing them out, but they're also changing the behavior of what you're allowed to do, quote, in the spaces where people had grown up, as an outside enforcer of that. And that's the part that's like insulting on top of, the financial push of it.
Yeah, I was happy that DC wasn't muted, but for sure it's like, from my experience, I only see white people go to like the caucasity that they have.
Here we go.
Oh man, we're getting there. We're going.
Yeah.
All I'm saying is like
it's like, who are you? Like my dad went to Howard, right? And he would talk about, and I have a cousin who went there too, and they would talk about the lawn, right? Where like no one would step on the lawn as you're walking through there. And then people come in and they buy out that territory and then they treat the culture and how the expectation, the social rules of that thing in a completely different context, right? In a way that takes away from the people who had existed there for a long period of time, on top of the financial situation of like getting pushed out.
Yeah. And look at this comment. Gordon Wolf was on top of it. They're on top of it because I remember Preakness. I never went, but I think actually I wasn't in Maryland when it would happen over the summers because I would typically be elsewhere out of state. And I grew up in Maryland, so
you like that one, caucasity.
But I remember oh man, yeah, the caucasity. I've known about that one for some time. But yeah. So Preakness, I didn't even know that was like. I actually thought it was just a more weight event because it's horse racing, for those who don't know. So it's a big horse race that happens in Baltimore. So I just assumed it was going to be mostly weight. But I didn't realize it was actually like got a good local turnout that would charge visitors. And then now that's shut down. That's actually kind of crazy. I mean, obviously COVID has messed up a lot of things, but it's crazy how that affects some of these like local like income generations, right? So a lot of places, that's another thing with COVID about how that's been hurting some of these areas. That get a lot of tourism, so and a lot of local people who can profit off of that. Vegas, of course, comes to mind, and there's definitely parts of Vegas that are heavily black, but that hurts everyone there. So that's an interesting, I guess, use case of it with Preakness and some of the other locals who've lost out.
Yeah, I'm with you, mindful boy.
I mean, whenever we get more capital as a whole race, then we'll be able to go and be the colonizers.
Oh man, they're not ready. People aren't ready for that.
I mean, we wouldn't do it the same anyway. We'll just go around spreading love. So.
There you go. There you go. Man, this has been a very eye-opening conversation. Typically we'll cut it off at an hour, but because of how unique this topic is, and I've learned a lot. Like me personally, I've learned a lot. Like the policing and gentrification, how that comes into play. Like clearly, because from where I'm from, it doesn't happen as much. But to know that it's happening that's happening in different areas, it's an eye opener. This is an extreme eye opener. So great, I appreciate you for that. Yes, Cuzzo, Caucasian. That's the first time I've heard that. Like 2 days. I kid you not. The first time I heard it, and I'm pretty sure now that I heard it, now I know what it is. It probably will not be the last. And so again, I thank you for the knowledge.
Hey.
And you guys, I mean, the chat, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. I know Gordo, for sure, thank you. Boys, Mindful Skeptics, thank you. And for anybody else that's been like chiming here and there, again, we appreciate you so much. If you guys haven't done so, like the channel, smash the notification button, subscribe, all of the good stuff. Because whether you guys believe it or not, like, these types of conversations is something that we have quite frequently, and we're going to keep continually having these conversations because it's needed. It's needed, and if it's the only space where if you want to have these type of time, if you want to have a conversation like this is the place to be. Because man, right back at you too, man. Nothing but love, and I thank you guys for sticking it out. Shout out to Gray. Thank you for joining us on this conversation, man. If you guys have not followed him, do you mind doing a little hashtag on?
Sure. Yeah, I'm on Twitter as Master Cat Herder. I don't tweet that much, but I do a lot of organizing. And so if you're trying to get involved in your local spot or get some stuff going with the Yang Gang, supporting some down ballot people, making things happen in government, hit me up. I will get you connected to the right people so we can, get our government moving forward.
There you go. You heard it from the man first. So
if you're ever in DC, pull up.
Hey, that's my city. Me and Toby are from that area, so.
Yeah.
Nah, Toby's over there from Clinton somewhere. I don't know what he's talking about. Oxon Hill, Clinton. Would you say Clinton?
No, Waldorf. So even further south.
Same stuff.
Are you out there? You're right.
But and I grew up in Salisbury, which is even further. Salisbury, Ocean City. So that's bad far.
No, in DC, pull up.
There you go.
I'll let you know for sure next time I'm down there. I'm long overdue.
I might get gentrified out, but not I barely held on to this little apartment. Everybody's like, "How did you find something for $950?" Because everything is
that's good. That's real good.
Right. So I barely made it. I held on, so I got lucky. But yeah, pull up.
All right,
you guys. We are off for tonight. Catch us next week. Actually, we have another special guest coming on next week, Wednesday. So it's going to be a different setup this time around. So again, stay tuned for that one, and we'll let you know as the days roll on. So, McCoy, Gray, we are out of here. Peace.
Good night, y'all.